Hi, just to check, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. I like POIs to be taken verbally, please. I'll take one after my first argument. Starting my speech, I use he, him pronouns as well. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The biggest disease that plagues societies in the status quo is the addiction the youth have to cigarettes and vaping. We think governments ought to eradicate this disease in the status quo we're so proud to propose. Before I posit two arguments in this speech, what exactly do we support under the side of government? Firstly, a four-prong model. Number one, we support countries implementing their own version of the generational endgame bill. What does this look like? Roughly three things. First, gradually phasing out the sale and supply of tobacco products, which will naturally drive up prices until eventually the sale of them is stopped completely. Secondly, countries' own governments will be able to tailor the bill to best fill their local health conditions, but at the bare minimum, we think it involves stopping individuals who have been yet to reach the age where they're eligible to vape or smoke from ever being able to. And thirdly, I'd like to clarify that this isn't an outright ban of smoking, but rather what this policy does is prevents individuals from ever being able to enter into smoking and developing physiological problems as a result of that. Two, we think in the meantime, we're perfectly happy with supporting rehabilitation programs to help current users stop using tobacco products. Thirdly, I'd like to note that given this is a supports motion, we have fiat to enact our policy and ensure its effectivity to a certain extent. Fourthly, note that the burden on opposition today simply cannot be more harm than good, because given that smoking in the status quo poses serious risk, as I'll later on prove in my speech, opposition needs an active solution to an active harm. I'd like to be very clear about what our burden is before I get into two arguments in this speech. Note that we don't need to stop everyone from continuing to smoke, but rather, insofar as we're able to prevent a future generation from destroying themselves via smoking and vaping, we think we've proven enough to take this debate. Two arguments then in my speech. The first, as to why we are the most effective in preventing more people from opting to smoking, particularly the youth, and secondly, on a principle, why is it legitimate for states to enact this policy? On to the first argument. There are three parts underneath this. First of all, I'd like to just launch a comparative straight away and explain why opposition's attempts to prevent younger generations from smoking always fail. Three structural reasons. But first, note the premise of this argument is simple. It's that governments already recognize the necessity to drive people out of smoking. Because in the status quo, even though we may give a certain autonomy to individuals to an extent to allow them to do things like smoke, governments recognize the need to curb this choice from ever being made, which is why they make it extremely difficult to opt into smoking to begin with by doing things like restricting the sale of tobacco products and setting things like price floors to drive up the price of these goods. But I'd like to note that on the side of opposition, all policies regarding smoking are very soft line because you don't actually prevent individuals from purchasing the good, which is why these products continue to remain in circulation and individuals can easily buy them. Even things like attempting to educate people and inform them about the risks are unsuccessful because it simply cannot compete with lucrative advertising used by tobacco and vape companies. The second part of this argument is why we're able to prevent new people from entering the system, which continues to sustain the market for cigarettes and vapes. Because the only reason why cigarette and vape companies remain popular in the status quo is because once young users use it, you get hooked onto it and you continue to buy it because of a necessity to satisfy your appetite. We think it's especially pernicious for younger individuals because they need to consume far more of the product in order to gain the same level of satisfaction that they would have on the first time they used it. We think this impact is round winning because what we're able to do is we prevent young individuals from ever being to enter the system and get hooked onto these products in the first place. Meaning that, unlike the side of opposition where we need to deal with the issue of things like the youth becoming addicted to tobacco products and then us needing to deal with the ramifications of that, we think we prevent young individuals from ever getting hooked onto these products in the first place, meaning we never need to deal with the problem of making young addicts cull their addictions, because we think if individuals never are able to experience what it's like to be hooked onto cigarettes, that isn't a problem we need to deal with on the side of government. Lastly, we think this is the most effective solution in ensuring a permanent phasing out of smoking. So we concede maybe the impacts of this policy won't manifest in the short term because levels of smoking smoking and vaping will relatively remain unchanged because the current generation of adults are still using these products. But we think eventually, as these adults die out, we think at least a new generation of individuals in the long term who never had the experience of smoking, which is why demand for all these goods will eventually be zero. So the conclusion of this argument is simple. We're able to prevent more youth or youth ever in the first place opting into smoking, which means in the long term, individuals no longer need to suffer from the harms of smoking. Before I get into the second argument, sure, I'll take a point.
Just to be very clear on your model and policy, you're willing to put young people in jail for the usage or the selling of these drugs.
Yeah, I mean, in the status quo, we already punish individuals above the age of 10 for doing things like crimes. So unless the opposition case is going to be, it's unfair to put individuals in jail. No, clearly, the state recognized as a standard, and especially when an individual chooses to violate the law, that is when it's permissible to do things like punish them under the criminal justice system. I'd like to note that most individuals who would likely dare to smoke would probably be above the age of 10, which in many countries is the standard already put them in things like jail. So opposition's case can't just be that 9-year-olds are going to smoke and we are going to put them in jail. On to the second argument as to why it's legitimate for states to enact this policy. Two parts underneath this. First of all, I'd like to note that the tobacco addiction is a massive drain on the state system in the status quo because we literally see millions of taxpayer dollars squandered attempting to mitigate the health impacts of smokers because we see money being used for things like lung surgeries on smokers, even though in the process they've knowingly damaged themselves, but now they're draining limited state resources by forcing the state to do things like fix their health, even though they caused it in the first place. Literally, in the same time, we're seeing tobacco companies allowed to massively profiteer while they're actively draining the state's resources. But secondly, why does this violate the harm principle in 3 ways? One, we think individuals aren't able, especially the youth, are unable to fully consent into opting into the use of things like cigarettes and smoking. Because maybe even though you're able to understand that it's detrimental to your health to an extent, you're unable to foresee or actually gauge what the manifestation of that harm in your own body looks like, which means that if you're unable to foresee that pain, you cannot consent to it. But note that all the aforementioned harms in my speech are literally irreversible because it's highly difficult to do things like reverse youth addiction and permanent lung damage that's caused by smoking. Finally, we think whenever you choose to do things like smoke or vape, it harms individuals because it's uncontainable. The reason why vape levels are so high in the status quo is because of peer pressure that coerces individuals to vape. If you want a long-term solution to prevent any individual from being harmed by smoking and vaping in the long term, then it's only right.
Okay, thank that speaker for that brilliant speech. Can you please welcome the leader of operation whenever they're ready, Shasha?
Okay, hi. Am I both visible and audible?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Let me just set up my timer. Okay. So, POIs verbally, he, him pronouns. Thanks. My time starts in 3, 2, 1. The issue with the government's model is that they assume that the model is just enforced by a perfect government and that their motion is set in the vacuum. We think that the motion is more likely about developing nations where the government's capacity to enforce these laws are not the perfect. They're more likely increasingly having like corruption. There's more likely going to have less capability to enforce these laws in the first place. I think firstly, I'd like to just clarify the ops burden, which is that this debate should be taking in place in most developing nations. That is to say, because most developing countries, like most countries in the world, are developing. Secondly, they're most vulnerable, and third, there's the least possibility of enforcement. So therefore, the metric of support to support this bill is to truly regulate the health of the new generation under these scenarios. I think firstly, the key characteristic of the generation end game bill is just that the government must prevent that vendors will be severely punished, and then the teenagers will also be severely punished. So the stance is just that we think that the counterfactual would be simply that we would regulate, and basically we'd have clean smokes and vape centers with the government, right? So like similar to like the New York City, like you have centers for these people to go to for if they want to smoke, and then we have like these clean centers for these people to go to. And secondly, would also reform education from the top, simply from like saying that these like from elementary, saying that smoking is extremely bad. And here's why the government cannot do this under this side, because the simply reason is just that when they are completely banning all the smokes, they cannot have a government center, and also cannot just simply talk about smoking as easily, simply because of the fact that they don't have the political capital to do so, right? So therefore, I think that simply the counterfactual would just be that we would continue allowing smoking for all ages, but the difference is that we would have the government producing these smokes and producing the vapes. Before I move on, I'll take a clarification.
Note that the context operates in the developing world, these countries don't even have sufficient funds to feed their own people. So you can't fiat into existence governments reforming the way the sale of tobacco works. You need to deal with the reality, which is why this debate needs to take place on a global context, not just narrowed down to developing countries.
But the developing countries is the majority of the scenarios in the world, right? But furthermore, I think that generally developing countries still do have the capability to produce some tobacco, right? Just firstly, already like companies that produce tobacco, we can presumably cooperate with them. It's unclear as to why we can't have this counter model on our side, where you're completely banning all this stuff and you're enforcing and sending out so much police to enforce this as well. So the argument we want to present is simply that the generational endgame bill pushes tobacco and vaping business underground. And this is generally the framing is that given this debate is about developing countries, developing nations has far less capability to enforce hard bans and total bans. And the reason simply is just that firstly, there's no infrastructure, right? Polices are not as trained. There's not enough transparency in the system. So therefore, we think that generally a hard ban completely fails the end goal that government wants to support. The premise of this argument is just that teenagers want to continue taking drugs, even if tobacco is banned. And the reason is twofold. First, older generations would still have access. No, thank you. Because firstly, because of the fact that there's a societal norm in these regions, that the fact that smoking is cool, smoking is in trend, therefore they're more likely going to support this. But secondly, that generally teenagers are rebellious, right? Like when the school tells them that, hey, you cannot smoke anymore, generally when they are said that this is not this is a bad thing, and this is compared to what their friends say, teenagers are rebellious and they want to try it out, right? So therefore, I think firstly, just because of social pressure, secondly, they are rebellious, but thirdly, for people who are already addicted, they can't stop using these drugs, and people throw away their lives and their families due to addiction. And we think that we posit that there are far more people that are younger that the government thinks are already addicted to drugs in developing nations that they posit, for example, in countries like Mexico. And the first layer we posit is just that developing nations' children are harmed to the maximum extent, because given that these countries have trouble to enforce these laws adequately, there are generally two scenarios that we posit will happen. The first is the more likely scenario that countries have no capability to enforce. This means that this pushes the tobacco business underground. Drug cartels that already exist, that are selling drugs, hard drugs like heroin, are likely going to get their hands on these tobacco and selling them in the same time in the same prominent areas. The distinct characteristic is that these drug cartels are extremely influential and can still promote them. This looks like the police forces are weak. In countries like Mexico and Latin American countries, police actively participates in the drug trade. It's easier for these the youth people, the drug cartels, or even the people consuming these drugs to bribe these police. So we think that simply that the police force is extremely weak, and this is extremely harmful because one, there's no control and oversight. There's no standards of what the material is being used, how clean the scenario is being used under using the production of tobacco. Secondly, there's no constraint on the quantity. There's more likely going to be overdose. There's more likely going to be people taking too many cigarettes a day that they will completely harm their health. But thirdly, there's no restriction on age. So even if, sure, that might be in a fringe scenario where that younger people that want to smoke, I think that generally it does exist in the sense that when they're countries that have child soldiers, there are countries that allow people that have countries. There are countries that have children smoke at an extremely young age due to the societal pressures and due to the narratives that they do spread. The second scenario is that in developing countries would go overboard, and this will turn into a drug gun war similar to the Philippines. No, thank you. This means that basically when police are going all out, arresting people and torturing people for the information for these drugs, this means that firstly, there are going to be more and more people that have to join gangs or join local drug cartels because they don't feel safe. They have to have found alternatives for these people to stay in a safe haven so don't get beaten up by the police. Secondly, there's largely distrust in the government because the simple fact that when the police are constantly on patrol in the city on a lockdown, they're more likely going to be distrust in government. So before I move on, I'll take a POI.
The context of the debate cannot take place in a failing state where even the government cannot uphold their own laws, because then neither side can claim their benefit of addressing smoking. At the very least, on government, we're supporting a solution to an active problem. You condemn children to die from secondhand smoke.
Yes. Firstly, these scenarios are not a failing state, right? Countries like Philippines are not a failing state. They have a like functional government, but the governments are not as accountable as other governments. Similar to like countries in similar countries like in the Latin America, where like Mexico, right? These countries are existing in countries, and this says the emotion says to support in other countries. Therefore, you still have to defend these cases and the majority cases in developing countries. And the impact is that for the comparative is far better because firstly, we have regulated and clean centers for these people to go to. And secondly, we have a trust in the government so that the people actually buy into the government in the sense that smoking is bad and that they actually buy into the educational system. So therefore, I think we're more likely going to get a far more controlled scenario where when government tries to entirely have a hard ban on these drugs and these vapes, they're unlikely going to succeed because of the majority of scenarios are developing countries. For these reasons, we're extremely proud to oppose.
Thank that speaker for that brilliant speech. Can we please have the Deputy Prime Minister whenever they are ready, Shasha?
All right. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. I'll take points in the chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Smoking kills, and by choosing to ignore reality, Dialogy killed their own case too. Because the problem with this opposition case was choosing to debate in a bubble. Because I want to note, their burden of pushing developing countries as the main context of this debate was completely asserted. And strategically, it does not make much sense for them to do so either. First, if your state was so corrupted and an imperfect actor that could not enforce any policy, then their case cannot work at all because it's still contingent on the premise that it's the same corrupt state that is going to be enforcing the policy of having rehab centers, of putting out education. So if it's the same corrupt state that wants to have their own self-interest placed as the priority, none of those policies also work because the actors at the top want to maximize their own like benefits or monetary gain. That is why, in order for this debate to operate, both sides need to assume a somewhat functioning state. But secondly, I think smoking is also a global problem. I mean, even the info slide states that New Zealand has enacted its policies as well because people globally are suffering from the issue of smoking. Their only response here was that you aren't also be able to get the same impacts of things having rehab centers because it is a trade-off of political capital to do so. We have two major responses to this. The first is that actually the opposite is true, in which you're more likely to get political capital to enact this policy at the point where you have the generational endgame bill. The reason for this is that when people recognize the heights of smoking and why it needs to be curbed and notes that the governments are making active action towards this, that's when you compound all the benefits of things like education and wanting to have rehab centers in the first place. But the second reason as to why they don't have the political capital is not for the reasons that first already tells you about why this imposes an active cost on the state right now when great amounts of people are opting into smoking. But even assuming their absolute best case that you hear from the leader of opposition, I want to point out that their entire case is still a negative one because they don't actually push to you an active harm of this policy. Even if their harm is still maybe 10 children will still be coerced into smoking because it's seen as cool. On their side, there'll be 100 people smoking because you never had the bill to stop it in the first place. So this is all mitigation, and therefore, they are accusers of the same harms that they wanted to defend at the end of the day. To clarify the burden here, we never had to prove that every single person stops smoking. And if there are certain people who fall through the cracks, that's probably going to happen in our worst case on both sides. But what we're able to prove is that an overwhelming amount of people probably will not opt into the black market. They will probably transition away from smoking in the long run. And 100 years down the line, we won't have to face this massive cost into the future. Before that, I'll take a point.
Yeah, so please don't misrepresent our nuance in first. We told you that it's significantly harder for developing governments to carry out actions directly against vaping when so many industries are for it.
No, actually you did not say that in the first, but to respond to this anyway on the idea of the economy, I want to say three things. The first is that we are slowly transitioning out from this, which is why we don't have an outright ban on smoking, and therefore anyone above the age of 18 right now can continue to smoke. But as that market becomes smaller, that is when these tobacco companies can change their business models to something else. So you give them the amount of like cushion time to be able to do this in 30 years. But we also give things like smoking actually causing huge economic costs, like health damages. It's a massive burden on state healthcare. But second, on the pollution and packaging of cigarettes. But also, we just pointed out why it isn't just solely developing states, so they have to argue in both contexts, but also the developing states will also be the ones spearheading the changes on their side. So if they want policy and you don't want absolute just free market for everyone, then they also have to assume it's somewhat functioning state policies. There are going to be 3 issues, and I'll talk about them. First, on the social enforcement and the effectiveness on this. Second, on the black market. And third, about why we improve all forms of people and their health here. The first is on the social enforcement, because their major response is that there's a glamorization of smoking, and therefore people are going to opt into this anyway. The problem was that this was highly unnuanced, because that's a response against status quo policies and ignore how this generational endgame works, which was that probably there are going to be some people that maybe get cigarettes from their parents, but the problem is that you aren't going to be buying these outright, which means that you really reduce the market for these things, so you get a less supply of cigarettes for these people. But second, the glamorization of smoking doesn't happen as less people get access to smoking. So even if it's a small amount of people and just the 10% or 5% of children get smoking, they don't have enough of an impact to need it to spread it to lots of kids to be able to opt into smoking, because they can't see it as glamorized anymore. In fact, especially since as per their burden push, it may be criminalized by the state. The second thing here is on the harm towards people. Note there's a major tension in their case, because in the point they claim that people are now going to go to jail for smoking, which is A, obviously untrue because we have things like juvies, but B, also these are just not solely children, like they're also going to be adults in 30 years time who were born after the date of 2007 or 2008. But C, note that we can have differing standards for people, like we don't have to have a complete go to jail for 2 years, we can often impose fines on people like this. But if all of this is true, then it also proves our argument for why they won't opt into the black market, which is the second point here, or why the black market does not make sense. The first was that this argument is contingent on the initial premise that young people have a strong demand to smoke, which we prove to you doesn't exist anymore, because the state has many other mechanisms to prevent you from smoking, and less people are smoking, so it can't be seen as cool. It's nothing is seen as fear of missing out. But second, many people also don't know how to use the black market. Like, you need connections to do this. You need information. You need to have tunnels. You need to have people that you know how to access the black market. And given that you don't care enough about smoking to want to do this, it doesn't become as important to you anymore because you have other priorities. Third, fear. At the point where it comes too high of a personal or financial cost to you, the cost-benefit analysis pushes you away from smoking. Per their own analysis, if you're going to go to jail and it's such a high cost towards you, you probably will pivot away from smoking. So therefore, this argument already proves why people won't opt into the black market. Like, presumably many people find some things cool, but they'll not do it if they know that there are other costs associated with it. They are higher than the potential benefits they can gain here, which very nicely leads us to why thirdly, why this is going to be good for people. Because even if you assume autonomy, the first thing is that you can't argue autonomy in abstract, because states don't support complete autonomy anyway, and per their own analysis, states already want to limit smoking here. But second, to directly deal with autonomy, these are not meaningful autonomous choices, because you're still going to be addicted towards smoking. The nicotine is in your brain, and know that this is uniquely chemical addictions, which means you can't pivot away from other things. So even if other things are addictive, like gaming, these are things that you're still not within your brain because it doesn't enter your body. But third is on mutual exclusivity, because there's nothing inherent about smoking that makes it fun or economically viable. Sure, some people mean an added level of gratification from smoking. Maybe some industries are contingent upon tobacco being sold right now, but most of these things are able to be substituted over time. Like, presumably 100 years ago, slavery was going to be good for the economy, but most of these things were also able to push up because states also have to measure the social costs. So we are happy to trade off incremental amounts of gratification or economic gain if it means more people are protected in the long run. Know all the harms able to tell you from first that did not receive response, on the major bodily harm, on the irreversibility of health harms, and the third party impacts impact far more people than just yourself. This is a selfish act that kills many people around the world, and we've never been prouder to propose.
Thank that speaker for that brilliant speech. Can we please have that yellow when they're ready, Shasha?
All right. Can I just confirm that I'm audible?
Yes, clear.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So he, him pronouns, please, and POIs through audio, because I probably won't be looking at chat. Okay. Time will start in 3, 2, 1. Look, I'm just gonna make 3 clarifications right off the bat. First of all, when we're talking about about the context of where this debate actually takes place. I think my partner has made it clear. We're talking about developing nations most likely in the side of the world, simply because of the fact that A, there are more quantities of developing countries rather than developed. Second, the people who smoke inside these nations are significantly more than individuals inside developed nations in the first place. Therefore, if we're considering to protect the most vulnerable actors, i.e. individuals who are in low economic areas who are more likely going to get addicted in the first place, I think we have to take into consideration that these are probably the contexts we're talking about, such as in the Philippines in the first place. Second of all, even if we're talking about developed nations, I don't think that the opponents have really mechanized as to why their specific case will actually specifically work. I'll extend later on as to why comparative works so much better inside these nations in the first place. But just briefly, note that on our side, because we get so much more buy-in inside these nations, we're more likely going to get more effective progress in the first place. Third, notes that all the impacts could basically, in their argument about how it's principally legitimate, entirely relies on their practicality. It entirely relies on them being able to prove that they're somehow able to reduce all the exposure to people smoking in the first place. If they don't do this, the entire principal harm about how they're going to be able to save money from the government simply doesn't make any sense. On our side, if we're able to prove we're able to do this better, we literally take their principle in the first place. Now then, 3 clarifications out of the bat. I'll just move on to my 3 things I'll talk about in my speech. One, on this entire issue of exposure, which is the thing that the entire proposition case hinges on. Second of all, on safety of drugs, how we're going to know thank you, protect much more individuals on our side. Third, on comparative, why we're so much better at reducing smoking, as well as how well we're going to respond to people who already smoke. On the overall issue of exposure, because this is what proposition basically relied their entire case on. What do they tell you? They tell you that, well, because of the fact that you cut off the individual's demands to be able to smoke, you're therefore going to get no exposure to smoking in the first place. 4 responses to this overall point. I think my partner has made very clear the inherent incentives that people have to be able to smoke. There's already media in the past that already glorifies and glamorizes smoking in the first place. Don't buy into their characterization that, well, it's just a recent issue focusing on the status quo, because it is not. Under their side, older people still smoke. Under their side, movies where protagonists are shown as cool still smoke. Individuals still have an inherent incentive to be individuals who want their side. We don't see how they're going to remove it. I think their side, they're going to even notes that it is because of the fact that their own model basically said that we're going to slowly phase them out. It means that you have individuals like these companies going to most likely phase out into the black market, most likely going to phase out to the underground market in the first place. On their side, because of the fact that it's a slow process, you basically allow these individual actors who want to be able to sell smoking in the first place to more likely transition more easily. This also means that you're more likely going to advertise more easily under this stage of time, because simply enough, you're basically giving them time to do whatever the hell they want. Therefore, on their side, you're basically, no thank you, going to allow these individuals to more likely peddle the smoke out to individuals under the black market. They're more likely going to enable them to actually form in the first place. Therefore, realize that on their side, they actually still have exposure to some extent. Third, realize that for a lot of these individual teenagers, even if you don't get exposure, there is already an inherent incentive for a lot of these individuals to basically go in conflict with most of the law. Take, for example, the war on drugs. Obviously, there's been lots of exposure telling individuals that this isn't good. The war on drugs basically enforces incredibly toughly all these drugs in the first place. Rather, you still have more teenagers wanting to do drugs in the first place because, one, a parental of the incentives around their entire household and their low economic community. Second of all, because their inherent want to be rebellious and to want to get high in the first place. Notes that therefore on their side, you basically get similar exposure anyways because of the context they're unable to be able to respond to in the first place. Under the context of a lot of developing nations, I'll take it later, realize that you don't limit this in any way when their homes are essentially surrounded by smokers in the first place. Therefore, on their side, you still have tons of individuals who are going to smoke. The impacts of peer pressure still happen. Fourth, assuming that you're still going to get zero exposure. We already showed you that the most important thing you have to consider is the health and the lack of addiction for a lot of these individuals. If on our side we're able to prove they are going to reduce this in the future, I think on our side, even if we're targeting a smaller group of people, I think we get better impacts because we're more likely going to save their lives. Rather on their side, we're still going to have individuals who are addicted, who are still going to get lung cancer because of all of these issues. Note that therefore on their side, exposure isn't necessarily the one thing that is going to solve the problem. Because even if you don't have exposure, people are so inherently incentivized to try to pursue these types of things. We don't see why their side actually has an effective case when all of their methods simply don't work. Before I move on, Cheryl, I'll take the point.
So do you think people will enter the black market and smoke to be cool because of a movie when it's criminalized and the state has multiple barriers to prevent you from access?
Okay, I understand your lie. Drugs are basically illegal under the world. People still do them because they want to be able to get high. They want to be able to pass their time. Second of all, individuals are actively rebellious when inside their households, when are most likely going to be low economic households. They're incentivized by individuals inside the community. They're incentivized to join gangs. Third, under the context that they're going to be hardline about this, they're more likely going to join gangs rather than follow the government because they don't see the government as an individual that's trustful. Now then, on to the second thing about safety, because we have to know that's an incredibly important thing for the proposition to consider. On their side, essentially, they do nothing on this. They just tell you that, we're happy to support some sort of rehabilitation system, and they're more likely going to have them on their side because now they're going to basically change the narrative to banning all smoking. We just don't see why this is the case. There's not enough governmental capital for you to basically expand the police force so you'll be able to track down smokers and also have the rehabilitation at the exact same time for zero return. We just don't think any government has the capability to mobilize this, especially for developing nations. Even in the best case of a developed nations, they're unlikely going to do this. Take, for example, prohibition, where they're unable to solve addiction for alcohol when they're expanding the police force. Notes that therefore on their side, they have no method of combating safety. Rather, we already told you on our comparative, which is a great way to transition into more my extension of my partner's case. Essentially, note that on our side, you're more likely going to have safety under this. People are more likely going to be regulated in terms of how they're going to smoke and what smoke they're going to be using, because my partner has already told you, A, there's no regulation for the smoking age. B, there's no regulation for what you use inside smokes. C, there's no regulation for what you use in per quantity. On our side, you are able to actually enforce all of this. Know that it is easier to enforce that expanding the police force. We have to rely on individual agents on their side. Rather, you only have to rely on people who want to be able to sell these products on our side. Therefore, you're actually going to get better effects for individuals who are already addicted, and you're more likely going to solve addiction, where you're allowing individuals to go through things of rehabilitation and slowly phasing out smoking in general. Note that therefore, even inside cases of developed nations, we're more likely going to enforce our policy better because they have more return. There's more likely going to be money for them in the government in the long run, and it is more likely that people are going to buy into this system. Therefore, note, based on this crucial characterization, we on our side basically support a world where we're going to actually solve smoking. Their side is essentially taking it back to it when they're going to incentivize more people to smoke. You're incentivizing cartels to get stronger. We don't think their side solves the problem at all. We are so proud to oppose.
I will thank that speaker for that brilliant speech. Can we please welcome the Gov whenever they are ready, Shisha?
I just checked I'm perfectly audible.
Yes, you are clear.
All right, cool. Give me a quick second. All right. I'll take POIs verbally. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. I want you to fully lay out on the table what you have heard so far and see which team is better here. The Gov gave you multiple reasons for why smoking kills and needs to be gradually transitioned out of society to prevent millions of addictions and broken families in the world. Op tells you maybe the police is bad, maybe we aren't able to enforce it, so we should just give up. I think Gov fiat to enforce the law aside, this debate is also a supports debate. So even in the absolutely worst case, where you bought all of the arguments that this law will be ineffective, the principle to staunch the harms of smoking onto individuals saw virtually no rebuttal throughout all the op speakers. By the op whip, it'll be far too late for them to have a case shift. I think maybe if the op paid as much attention to the debate as they did heckling the Gov speakers, they might have an actually functioning case. There's one extraneous rebuttal that I want to get into before moving on towards the two issues I have in this speech. Firstly, I want to note that op seemed very frantic to hop onto the motion narrowing bus and say that this debate is only about developing countries and refuse to debate about countries like New Zealand and the US. Because the majority of countries are developing, because the vulnerability is higher, and it's harder to enforce laws there. Those are the three kinds of layers that they have said that actively enforce this sort of framing. I just want to note that none of these reasons make any sense to help them with the reframe, because literally all of them are very heavily asserted without any real points to actually prove them. There are various kinds of developing countries, so even in a case where maybe there are more developing countries than developed countries in the world, just because they're developing countries doesn't mean they're failing states. You often have developing countries that have functioning police and governments that still can function properly. Anarchy in the black market does not run rampant within these countries like Malaysia. It is that cannot function that the op wants to talk about, and these are the only states that they actually want to discuss that are in the minority. We tell you why, insofar as governments are still fairly functional, that insofar as you do have police that actively enforce certain like these laws, but moreover, we have the support of GovFiat to be able to also enforce and support these particular policies. That means to say that even in the case we're talking about developing countries, these are not the kinds of developing countries that op wants to talk about. So therefore, the entire idea behind having more developing countries in the world does not actively function. But secondly, what kind of metric is vulnerability to smoking? I would posit that insofar as there's someone who is also smoking within your vicinity, you are also vulnerable to smoking, regardless of whether you live in the US or the Philippines. The only reason as to why developing countries have far more individuals who are also smoking currently is because these developed countries have similar policies that are also being actively enforced on our side as well. The US has a smoking age of 21. That means to say that they don't sell cigarettes towards people who are below that age. We tell you why this also falls under the premise of the Gov, and that's exactly as to why these people are so much less vulnerable. We would posit it works to our advantage, because if you want to model off of countries that are far less vulnerable to smoking, it's because these countries are actively using these policies. It is because of that this policy should be supported. But I think even if it's true that this debate was only about developing countries, then I would note that, as pointed out throughout all of our responding speakers, none of their model actually would work either. Because if it's true that you don't actually have the police that's functioning in order for you to properly enforce these particular policies of yours, that also means to say that you won't be able to get the proper drug rehab centers that you have, because your governments are still going to be pickpocketing money because they're so corrupt. You're not going to be able to have the education campaigns, and you're not going to be able to actively educate the public if it's true that the entire idea behind law enforcement is a complete myth. In that case, I don't think it's possible for this debate to function in a world where we only discuss developing countries. We told you since the beginning, it has to develop from a global context. Since POIs towards the LO, I don't think they've actually managed to engage with any of that. But even if we didn't engage with any of those three layers towards why they support the reframe, we literally only have to read the info slide to tell you why you're wrong. New Zealand is not a developing country. It is a developed country that's fully capable of supporting itself. So if they don't want to talk about countries like that, then they are literally ignoring a massive part of the motion that's literally half of the examples within the info slide. What does this mean for their case? I wouldn't underestimate the amount of their case that was reliant on this mischaracterization, because their whole LO speech on poor police management and government therefore does not work. Their whole DLO speech on people who are being desperate for the black market and would still smoke and buy cigarettes anyway would not work, because none of their model actually works either, because corrupt states do not properly set up these drug rehab centers, because the ability for you to also still prevent these people from being addicted is still largely limited because of the fact that your own enforcement structures do not properly function. But I also wouldn't underestimate, therefore, how much of the motion the case is not about. So even in the very worst case, where they maybe win on the 25 failing states that have trashy police and corruption running rampant, there is still the 160 governments that we take upon for free that are still capable of actually preventing these people from entering addictions. That we still save millions of lives from being able from actively being destroyed by smoking and cigarettes because of the fact that we're actually able to transition these particular countries out of smoking. In that sense, I think based on that particular reframe in itself, they have lost the debate, because it's the only thing we wanted to talk about throughout all three speakers. Before we move on, is there a point?
Even inside developed context was your absolute best case. Realize that cartels are still strong. Realize that there's still a strong incentive for people to pursue all these types of things because of their inherent demand to want to.
Okay, I'm going to deal with enforcement a little bit later in the speech. But how do we more properly protect people from smoking within the first issue? I want to note that OP also doesn't have any positive impact regardless. I think even after we called them out in DPM, DLO still saw no analysis on how they would help protect people better. So maybe if we stretch it really far, we're going to count that one liner in LO about maybe setting up drug rehab centers for to help rehabilitate people as some sort of positive content. But their main contention, therefore, is the POI, which is people are going to smoke regardless because they're desperate, they're rebellious, and poor people and peer pressure still exists. I want to note that their model is actually inexclusive, because we told you in our model as well that we would also support drug rehab centers offenders, and we will also support rehabilitation. That's not going to be like exclusive regardless, because if we're talking about governments in a global context, I'm pretty sure you have the funding to be able to fund a few drug rehab centers to at least help people transition out of their drug addictions and their smoking addictions. But even if they prove incentives exist, they don't prove the link between incentive and capability to smoke. We agree the op that smoking still exists in society, but this is a ban. We're making it illegal for these people to purchase cigarettes, which is why there is still a structural barrier that prevents these people from being able to buy cigarettes, because if you're unable to procure an ID that says that you are 18 years of age within this particular country in a convenience store, you're not going to be able to get those cigarettes even if you wanted to smoke in the first place. We agree that a blanket ban that targets people who are already affected will be counterproductive and will inspire a black market. But the kinds of regulations that OP will use cannot involve an age barrier whatsoever. The world that the OP needs to defend is one where 12-year-olds can walk into convenience stores and purchase a cigarette. A world where 14-year-olds in New Zealand are deemed eligible to begin a smoking addiction for themselves. We gave you plenty of reasons why smoking is actively harmful towards people from the first two speakers. So on virtually no engagement on either OP speaker, they only wanted to talk to people about what kind of countries this particular motion is about. If they wanted to die on that hill, they're welcome to. We took the entire debate for every other fund that it's on.
Well, thank that speaker. Can you please have the operation clip whenever they're ready, Shakur?
Okay, great. Can everybody see me and hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Just 1 second. Speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, smoking and selling cigarettes may appear using props rhetoric like the disease that hurts our society, but in fact, it is oftentimes seldom the only solution that is caused by no alternatives for many families and many institutions in developing countries. We think this is the context that proposition team ignores, and this is what's going to win us the debate. I want to answer 2 questions. First of all, the implementation of the policy, which side actually gets the policy across, and secondly, the well-being of the new generation. First, on the implementation of the policy, I want to note a few things, right? First of all, proposition depends on proving 2 premises. The first is that companies and people within these countries will accept this new bill, and secondly, that therefore the new generation will not be exposed to drugs. And note that this itself is the only basis for all of their impacts, and they barely spend much time mechanizing it. The strategy that I'll use here is I'll prove to you first why smoking will continue because industries rely on it, and secondly, that's why exposure will also continue, and then I'll prove why underground harms are so bad, which was basically ignored by entirety of proposition. The first premise, why exactly will we not phase out all the tobacco on-site proposition, right? We told you that there are many types of entities that won't accept this. The first are multinational corporations that depend on advertising and depend on things like selling vape cigarettes because they already have a lot of machinery in place. The second thing is that gangs and entire groups of families, for these people, it is the only way of their survival. There are no alternatives because oftentimes in society, there are no good education systems. There's no way for you to earn money other than to actively join a gang because that's where you geographically are located closest to. You can't reach out to other people because that's what your family and parents did as well. I'll take it later. But the third type of thing that we gave you was that tobacco industries, even if you give them a lot of time to phase out, are still irreversible. The fact that you already have a field full of tobacco and the fact that tobacco can't be used for anything else except things like marijuana or cigarettes means that you can't substitute this industry out. This means that millions of workers will still depend on selling cigarettes on their side of the house. So when they try to ban this, when they try to phase it out, we think it's very, very likely that these companies won't do it. Instead, these workers will go underground. Instead, they will still want to create industries because of this dependence, right? Like the obvious thing here is that these industries have existed for hundreds of years. They've started since opium in China, and you know how addictive that is. We think these industries are likely to continue, right? So this means in the first premise, we just tell you that even if you slowly phase out these types of industries, these companies will mostly move underground. I think that's very reasonable to assume. But secondly,
point.
Their second premise is that, no thank you, that this exposure to young generations will now phase out. Three mechanisms that we gave you that were basically ignored. The first is that groups underground and underground companies and corporations will still actively reach out to these people. Like, we know how powerful advertising is. When you combine that with things like AI, which self-improves itself, knows how to target you, literally based on how much you swipe in your phone, and pops up on things like Instagram because it's hard to regulate, means that people will be targeted. But secondly, and this is the most important thing about this debate, the most vulnerable people on the side of proposition are targeted. This looks like the African American that is living in the poorest neighborhood, who needs to depend on things like vape, because that's either the only way they get money, or either the only way that they can escape their terrible livelihoods. This is what proposition forces these people to go to jails on their side of the house. We would much rather help these people. But thirdly, like, look, the situation is very dire. Look, Earth is not looking very good right now. You see the invasion in Russia. Children are facing loads and loads more homework. We gave you reasons as to why exposure to drugs is likely, because you want to escape the thing that is happening in Earth right now that happens on both sides of the house. We don't think prop can fiat this out. Then, just on this premise, we think we already proved here that it's likelier on proposition that people still continue to use things like drugs. What is our counterfactual, and why do we implement our policy better? The first thing we say here is that rehabilitation and regulation policies are much easier to accept and enforce, right? This is because a lot of times this is good for individual addicts. Look at New York City's implementation of the distribution of nicotine pads and clean and free syringes. This allowed drug addicts to actually do their work and earn their money in a more careful, in a more safe way, and everybody accepted this to a large degree. We saw a lot of popularity in this program. These are the types of programs we want to accept. We want to support programs that actually help the drug addicts, that help people who are addicted to cigarettes, addicted to tobacco. We want to step in their shoes. And we're the only side that does this, because this is the only way that developing countries will accept the policy. On proposition, how are you going to tell the family that dependent on tobacco for whole generations to suddenly stop selling tobacco? We're the ones who help them phase it out in a more long run by teaching them the harms of tobacco. That's the difference of our policies. In developing nations, people accept our policy because it helps them in the future. People don't accept Prop's policy because it makes them broke and it kills them. Before I move on to why we help the young generation, I'll take a POI.
I imagine out of 6 speakers in this round, none of us actually know how to access the black market. Is the op case seriously reliant on the assertion that millions of 14-year-olds actually know how to enter
The
underground?
reason why we can't access the black market right now is because in a lot of countries, it is okay to smoke cigarettes. The moment when you ban this is when black markets are going to become much more prevalent. I'm going to prove this right now in the second clash. Why do they hurt the well-being of the young generation? And also, like, that POI, I think that was like very, very offensive. A lot of people don't live in developed countries. Okay, why do we help the well-being of the young generation? First of all, I want to talk about what Prop does because of the harm of moving underground, right? This is completely unmitigated by proposition, because the moment when people do still expose themselves to drugs, which is very likely, it might even be in things like candies that your friend gives to you, means that you're now going to be addicted to some degree. Just because you express your curiosity means that it's likelier that now prosperous underground situations are going to develop and evolve into things like being unconstrained in the material that you inhale, being unconstrained in the quantity and the medical equipment and the age of people doing this. This means not only you lose trust in the government because of increasing organizations that do move underground, but the expansion of networks inside the underground, because now people now depend on these things. They move to these things to get their job, to get their income, and to escape from their dire situations in real life. How are we going to weigh this up? Even if you accept the fact that proposition might move a few people underground, this should be weighed over any harm we get, because the amount of overdosage on their side of the house, the amount of increasing harms like sex abuse on their side of the house is extremely more than our marginal types of people who are casual smokers, right? This means on their side, they're targeting the most vulnerable and you're hitting them the hardest. The reason why we solve this is we allow them to phase it out in the future, providing them with programs that educate them, that help them, and provide them with alternatives. We're very proud to oppose.
Yeah, I would thank that speaker. Can we please welcome the reply speaker from side operation whenever they're ready, Shisha?
Hi. Am I both visible and audible?
Yes, you.
Yeah, cool, thanks. My time starts in 3, 2, 1. Gov would win this debate if their impacts actually manifested. We also hope that the youth addiction can fizzle out. But we don't live in a snow globe where we have unlimited fiat to both have hard bans and also have a rehab center in literally every single community in developing nations. I want to do 4 things in my speech. First, just talk about the one-liner coming from Whip that like the debate is about New Zealand because it's half of the examples in the info slide. Secondly, I want to talk about how we had positive material coming from first that they ignored. Thirdly, talking about exposure, and lastly, talking about safety. So first, I want to just deal with the one-liner, which is that like the half of the examples in the info slide is New Zealand. Firstly, if we want to literally go with literary analysis skills, the motion says this house supports other countries around the world. So therefore, they literally have to stand for other countries that are developing countries. And like they say that, oh, they are there are only fringe cases where developing countries are like failing states. I think first, like we gave the example of Philippines, right? Philippines is able to hold election. Philippines has a government. Philippines is not state like failing. But take them at their best, right? Even in the like our worst case, and even for the most developed countries like the USA, they still have poor communities, right? We gave you the example of like Black neighborhoods that literally cannot access government infrastructure, right? These communities are still in the same circumstances developing countries where they cannot access the same types of infrastructure as what the government wants to believe what a developed country looks like, right? So therefore, I think the first frame is just that our case still stands because in the most vulnerable scenarios where people cannot access rehab centers in developing countries and developed nations as well, these are people that we have to prioritize in our world. But secondly, they say that there's no absolute positive material because most of it is symmetric, right? And they say like, okay, they can also have rehab centers in every community and also reform education. Like obviously debate is about a trade-off, right? Like if they want to impact like having a complete ban on the like drugs, like they can't say that like we're already funding so much police, we're funding so much regulation on these drugs. They can't have the same amount of fiat to say that, oh, we're gonna actually also have rehab centers. Presumably there has to be a cut in the budget. And this is where we talk about we have far more regulation. We have far more rehab centers in the entire community, in the communities that need them the most, and more infrastructure for people to reach out. And this is where I lead to the safety argument, because we talk about distrust in government, because we say that when government has a complete hard ban, when teenagers are rebellious, when there's already an existing narrative that it's okay to smoke, that they're more likely going to join gangs than go to the government, because the simple fact that the gangs are more local, gangs are more safe, gangs are more tailored for those people in those communities. So therefore, I think generally it's far less likely for them to just like follow the government, because simply the government has power, right? We say that gangs also have power. Gangs also gangs don't get scared just because government says, oh, if you're part of the gang, you go to jail, right? So therefore, I think simply enough, they're more likely going to default in the gangs, especially in scenarios where there are hard bans like the war on drugs. But lastly, talking about exposure, right? I think generally the exposure argument they said just like, oh, exposure doesn't exist because people are scared. We already told you that the narrative already exists, and older people always still can smoke. Therefore, there's already enough influence for these people to actually buy into the narrative of smoking. The narrative is smoking is completely fine. Therefore, we say that like, given that they do not have counter fiat to just say like, oh, we're gonna reform the education system at the same time, we think that we win on the simple exposure clash, simply because the narrative is too far dominant, right? There are extremely powerful cartels and gangs, right? In poor like neighborhoods, the gangs dominate, and the poor the neighborhoods, like these gangs literally distribute these like drugs on a daily basis because they have the control over the entire neighborhood. Like similarly in like cartels in Mexico, they're able to completely bribe police, and the police are part of these gang trades because of the deals, because simply they have the control over these weak infrastructural systems, regardless in developed or developing nations. So for these reasons, I think we simply win over the complete premise of the government case we're proud to oppose.
Yep, I thank that speaker for that brilliant speech. To end the debate, can we have the counted by?
All right. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. I'm not sure if the opposition was paying attention because they decided to debate motion 2 about violent gangs rather than motion 3 about smoking. At the top of this reply, I'm going to take the highest possible burden for myself and assume everything they said holds true in this debate. If enforcement was weak and corrupt, If people wanted to smoke to be cool, if tobacco companies were predatory and wanted to coerce people into smoking, then it means all of their mechanisms will also not work, because the same context would also hold true, that people are going to be addicted to smoking. They will also be seen as cool. This is fatal for them because of their own burden push, because both the LO and especially the DLO say they want to end smoking. So if people were already hooked onto smoking, then they cannot fulfill their own burden. We came comparatively closer to it because we prevented people from wanting to access it in the first place. So on the metric of who's reaching their burden more, I think they have already set up one that's extremely implausible for themselves, because I think it's much more attractive to smoke when it's cool compared to when it's cool and illegal at the same time. Secondly, their policy was infrastructure, having drug rehab programs, education. We told you two things. The first, that these were notoriously ineffective right now because many people could still access it, and because per their own social incentives of glamorizing smoking, the people still opt to it anyway. And the only way to force people out of this was then to have some form of hard punishment onto them, or the preemptive mitigation we told you from all three speakers that received very little response. But even if you did not believe this and you believe their trade-off on political capital, we explained you got more political capital under our side because people knew the harms of smoking. The government were actually taking action, even if it's just a developing state. And at the same time, the state has less burdens from healthcare because less people are becoming sick, and therefore they're able to redirect more of this into helping smoking. I'm not going to spend more time on the developing country context challenge because we already took the charitable burden from first and second, that even if it was developing countries, why it will be done well. 3 questions: effectiveness, social, and the black market. First, will this policy be done well? We told you 3 things. 1, motion fiat. 2, per their own analysis, the states also want to enforce policies, so clearly they have some capital available for them. But third, per their own analysis, no state, developing or developed, wants to lose money. So truly, if there's going to be black markets because companies are going underground and they can't tax those companies anymore, or if people are going to smoke and cause additional healthcare burdens on the state, then therefore the state also loses out money. So even if they're completely self-interested, this wouldn't hold true for them. This is not new responses or new material. This is the line of logic that they wanted to push from all 3 speakers that they refuse to take into context how it affects their own case. But note, the number one reason why people refuse to stop smoking is because of addictiveness. You're still being able to be addicted to the nicotine in your brain. So if you prevent the nicotine from ever going into your brain, it doesn't matter if 10 people around you tell you it's cool, you were never hooked onto smoking in the first place. Second issue, their claim is that people will be rebellious and want to smoke. But you see, the really only hill that opposition wanted to die on, which funnily enough is their only material standing, was that people turn to gangs. Sure, a small minority of people who do this, but logically let's use some contextual realism here. The majority of people are not going to pivot towards this because they never felt a strong preference for smoking, or even if they did, they still had to weigh that up against the other costs, the costs that you might be fined with. If they are low income groups, then they won't want to be fined by this. They don't want to go to jail. I think it's quite insulting for them to claim that African American children only smoke for escapism and have 0 other alternatives. But I think these kids are far more averse to being punished. The motion also just isn't about kids, it's about people who will grow up and become adults in the future. This is being the peakness of our charitable case, where we told you that even if what they say holds true, it also works for our end. Third issue on economics. The op whip is actually quite funny here, because by case shifting to the new material on MNCs, they realize their case has no positive push. In fact, we preempted this from my speech, where we explained that the black market would not be able to do this because most people wouldn't want to opt into it, or even if they did, the states do have incentives to prevent this. For the companies themselves, giving them this 30 years cushion period to transition means they can change their business model over time, which is far more effective than on their side. We can continuously get people doing this. The conclusion is simple. If you truly wanted to end the vice of smoking, the generational endgame was the only way to go. You have to side with the government.
I would thank the speaker for that brilliant speech. Right now, me and my panelists will move on to another room, and we